Then on Sports Central, we go over our next schedule preview this offseason, and it's going to be over the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, a team that went 11-2 overall in the 2021 season. Overall, a pretty good season for Notre Dame, but how will this team be in 2022 is what we'll be going over here today. We'll be going over the players that this team will be losing, who they'll be returning, and also looking at their schedule for the first time this offseason, starting out with some notable games from last season. Once again, this team was 11-2 overall. So not a bad season for the Fighting Irish. This team barely missed the college football playoff, just one ranking below the top four. So this team was close, but couldn't quite make it. But either way, still a good season, 11-2 overall. They were 11-1 heading into their bowl game. So Notre Dame, this is a very talented football team last season, and heading into 2022, I think this is going to continue. I mean, this is still a team that definitely shows some great potential for the future. But looking at 2021 real quick, of course, this team beat Purdue 27-13. Turns out that was actually a pretty big quality win. Purdue turned out to be a pretty good football team last season that knocked off multiple top tier programs like Michigan State and Iowa. Of course, Iowa was ranked number 2 when Purdue beat them, so that was a good win there. Beat Wisconsin, number 18 team in the nation at the time, 41-13. Quite a win there for the Irish. Also lost to Cincinnati, which that game is the one game that came back to haunt them once we got to Selection Sunday. That game against Cincinnati, they lost to them and the Bearcats. That's a game that had a huge influence in setting them up to be in the college football playoffs. So that was a huge game for both teams, especially for the Bearcats, because guess what? Cincinnati was in the playoff last season. But they also beat USC 31-16, beat North Carolina by 10. They did lose to Oklahoma State, though, in their bowl game, 35-37, off of a blown lead. So, Notre Dame, they led that game for a long time, but Oklahoma State stormed back and took that game away from them. But in the end, still a good season if you look at it nonetheless. 11-2 overall, 5-1 in their first 6 games, and then 6-1 in their last 7. Roster preview heading into next season. Jack Cohen, your starting quarterback, is gone. That's going to be a tough loss there. Jack Cohen, of course, the Wisconsin transfer from 2020 to 2021. Had a pretty good season overall, 3,100 yards, 25 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and a 66% completion rate. So his stats overall were pretty good last year. He definitely was a quarterback that definitely impressed me, at least, and obviously filling in after Ian Book. Ian Book was a long-time starter for Notre Dame, so obviously there were a couple of question marks at the quarterback position going into next season, but Jack Cohen definitely had a good season. He definitely played well overall last year. And going into next season now, Tyler Buchner or Drew Pine, likely one of them will be your starting quarterback going into next season. I'd be very surprised if it was anyone else. So, overall for Notre Dame, it's going to be interesting to see who wins that quarterback battle, and this is still being recorded pretty early on in the offseason. We're in middle February right now, so we'll see what happens there over the course of the spring and into summer, who wins that starting position. But it's pretty clear. It looks like one of those quarterbacks will be your starting going into next season. Running back position, Kyron Williams is gone. That's going to be a tough loss. 1,300 yards, 17 touchdowns last season. I think people underestimate how big of an impact Kyron Williams really had on this team last season and over the course of his career with Notre Dame as well. So, that's going to be huge for this team, and they'll have to replace him. And it looks like Chris Tyree, your second running back last year, had a decent amount of receiving yards as well. Put up 480 overall offensive yards and 3 touchdowns last year. So, Chris Tyree looks like he's going to have a huge impact on the backfield. He's going to have a huge job going into next season, and we'll see what happens. But Kyron Williams, that will be a tough loss for sure going into next year. At the receiving position, you got Kevin Austin, of course, your top receiver, who is going to be gone. So that's going to be another tough loss. So you lose your starting quarterback, your top running back, and your top receiver going into next year. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. That's concerning in the returning production category there. But Austin last year put up nearly 900 yards and 7 touchdowns. But Michael Mayer, your Stark tight end, coming back. He had an insane season in 2021. Put up 840 yards and 7 touchdowns. Those are some insane stats for a tight end. So Michael Mayer is definitely a player to keep an eye on going into the future. Avery Davis, your second receiver, is also coming back, and Braden Lindsey, your third receiver, is coming back as well. So receiving core, not too concerned about that. You got 2 good receivers coming back, plus Michael Mayer, your tight end, who is, he receives a lot. He's a huge target, so that's going to be a huge part as well. But looking at the offensive line, you do lose one on there. You lose 2 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers as well, and then 1 in the secondary. So defensively, you do lose 5 starters, which is something to also keep an eye on. But overall, moderate amount of losses for this team going into next season. But the depth does look pretty good. I mean, overall, if you look at this recruiting, I mean, the recruiting for this team looks great going into next season, and we'll get into that in just a couple of moments here. But Notre Dame, this football team, I mean, losing Jack Cohen's going to be tough. And I think going into next season, I mean, this team, I think the chances of them making another college football playoff run are actually quite high. It's just a matter of whether Bushner or Pine, whichever quarterback wins that quarterback battle, if they play well and lead this team to a good season. I mean, they got to put up some good stats and make sure they don't turn over the ball much, because, I mean, Jack Cohen last year, that was a part of why he was so successful was, I mean, he didn't really turn over the ball very much. So, I mean, we'll see what happens in that quarterback situation. That's going to have a huge influence on how this team does going into next season. Transfer portal and recruiting going into next year. Of course, this team has lost a lot of players to the transfer portal. They did bring in Brandon Joseph from Northwestern, a safety. That's going to be a good addition to the backfield there. So, definitely keep an eye on him. But otherwise, this team loses quite a bit. They lose a safety to the transfer portal. Tight ends going to, it looks like Boston College. That's not for sure yet, but the crystal ball is saying 100% towards Boston College there. Then you got Jojo Johnson, a defensive back who is in the transfer portal as well. Quinn Carroll, Brendan Clark, who was a quarterback. He's off to Old Dominion. And then Jay Bramblett, a punter, is off to LSU. So this team has lost a few players to the transfer portal. Really haven't gained too many, but Brandon Joseph, that's going to be a good addition here to the secondary. Keep an eye on him. Recruiting-wise, this team is number 7 nationally, so definitely that's a great ranking. Definitely where you want to be if you're the Irish here. They got 1 5-star recruit coming in and 16 4-star recruits, and obviously, I mean, this is also something to keep an eye on here is their coaching situation going into next year. Obviously, Brian Kelly took off for LSU, so I mean, we'll see how this team does. I mean, coaching-wise, I think this team is in good hands, but obviously that's something to keep an eye on as well, is that this team did see a very significant coaching change at the end of last season and as we head into 2022, obviously. But that said, let's look at your schedule now going into next year. You start off the season with a bang against Ohio State. That's going to be quite a game there. Ohio State is a team that probably is the favorite right now for me to win the Big Ten. I mean, you got Michigan and Ohio State. Those are my 2 main teams that I think are your 2 biggest contenders once again for 2022. I don't see anything changing there from 2021 to 22. But Ohio State, that's going to be a tough game in week 1. You got to be ready to go. That's going to be a massive matchup in week 1, and definitely a resume builder if you want to make a college football playoff run. So that's a crucial game for week 1, that is for sure. Then you got Marshall the next week, so you get a bit of a break there. Then California and then North Carolina on the road to finish out your September. You got BYU in a neutral location on the 8th. You got Stanford at home, UNLV at home, and then Syracuse on the road to end out your October. And then November, you got Clemson at home, Navy in a neutral location, then Boston College and USC to finish out your season. So, I mean, overall, not a terrible schedule. I mean, USC on the road could be an interesting one. Clemson could be good next year. BYU is a team to watch out for as well. And North Carolina, of course, on the road. Can't forget about that one, too. And, of course, your huge game in week 1 against Ohio State. I mean, that's the biggest game of the season for this team, and it's in week 1, which is the crazy thing. So, I mean, week 1 is stacked with a lot of really good games. That's something that I've already noticed. And we're only like a month into this off season, but week 1 is going to be a very crucial week for a lot of teams, including Notre Dame and Ohio State. That game's going to be a huge one. But looking at your first 6 games here, Ohio State, I'm going to favor the Buckeyes in that game right now. That's a tough one. I mean, both teams are looking pretty good going into next season, but I'm a bit more confident with the Buckeyes. Fighting Irish, this is a football team that's got tremendous potential as well, but I am more confident with Ohio State. They got C.J. Stroud coming back. They got plenty of talent returning. Ohio State's going to be a team that, I mean, they were kind of inexperienced last year, and they're returning a lot of talent going into 2022. So I like Ohio State in that one right now. I mean, that's not an official prediction. We'll be predicting every game on this schedule one by one once we get to our official predictions in the late spring and summer. But Ohio State right now, I'm going to favor them in that matchup in week 1. Marshall and California, both easy wins, I think, right now. Cal, really not expecting too much out of them. The North Carolina on the road, I'm going to keep that as a yellow game, but I do want to favor Notre Dame. North Carolina, what a disappointment in 2021. I mean, that was a team that had Sam Howell and so much talent, and it was just a huge disappointment last year for the Tar Heels. So I do want to favor Notre Dame in that game right now, but it could potentially be close. BYU, very intriguing matchup there coming up on October 8th. BYU is returning quite a bit going into next year as well, so potentially they're a contender too So definitely a very interesting matchup between two independents on October 8th. And then Stanford, I'm going to say that's an easy win as well. Stanford, not really expecting too much out of them. For the second half of your schedule, you got UNLV, easy win there as well. Syracuse, I'm going to say an easy win for that one as well on the road. Clemson, that's a tough one to predict. I mean, you got the Tigers, who are probably my favorites to win the ACC right now. I mean, Clemson and NC State are my two main teams to keep an eye on, I think, in the ACC. Those are my two main, I would say, contenders to win the ACC title next year. So Clemson, they will improve going into next season. They'll be a better team in 2022 versus 2021. But I do want to favor the Irish right now in that game just because, I mean, it's in Notre Dame's house. So, I mean, Notre Dame's got a great home field advantage. So I'm going to go with Notre Dame in that game. It's going to be close, though. Navy, easy win. Navy, really not expecting too much out of them either. And Boston College and USC. USC, very interesting matchup. USC is a tough team to predict this offseason, potentially one of the most unpredictable teams. They were 4-8 last year, which is an absolutely horrendous record, and they were a major disappointment, one of the biggest disappointments in college football last year. But now they got Caleb Williams going in, they got Travis Dye going in, they got Lincoln Riley, a awesome head coach, going in as well. And those three players, or well, two players plus your coach Lincoln Riley, I mean, those three guys really change the shape of USC football. And I think USC is a team, defensively, they've got a lot to work on. But, I mean, the offense has got some playmakers now with Caleb Williams and Travis Dye in particular. So USC, that's a very interesting football game. I'm going to favor the Irish right now in that one, but it's going to be close for sure. Record projection, 9-3 to 12-0 for this team. So I do expect this team to definitely be a contender next year. 12-0 the ceiling, so I'm putting the ceiling pretty high for the Irish. But definitely, I think, I mean, there's a couple of question marks still on this, especially on the offense, losing your top running back and receiver, and of course Jack Cohen too. But I do expect this team to definitely, they got tremendous depth, so I'm not too worried in the end. But let me know your thoughts and comments below on this team, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.